Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catalonia, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by DairyBeef 500 advisor Sean Cummins to get an insight into the recent DairyBeef 500 farmer study trip to Spain. Sean, you're very welcome. What did you see on your recent trip?
Yeah, so Catherine, 14 farmers left for Barcelona there the second week in November to primarily see how Spanish calf to beef operations work. Over the course of the trip, we visit a number of farms in Catalonia region, so up in the northeast of Spain. We really wanted to focus on the calf to beef or calf to rosé veal units, but we also seen a number of suckler to beef units that are in operation over in Spain.
And what were the main differences you've seen between Spanish and Irish beef production systems?
I suppose, Catherine, what was really noticeable was the carcass specs which they're aiming to produce across both systems. So if we look at what they're trying to achieve a product that meets consumer needs, and their consumer requires a paler coloured meat that's lean. So what they're doing is they're killing the animals at younger ages. And in addition to that, we're seeing that they're aiming for a lighter carcass weight. So carcass weights that we typically see here that be penalised, so in the region of 220 to 240 kilos, they're actually wanted by the marketplace out there. And as you pass the 280 kilo mark, penalties are actually introduced, or lower price points are introduced for these.
Sean, over the course of the trip, you've seen a lot of dairy beef systems in Spain. What did you see and learn?
Yeah, I suppose, Catherine, it really stems down to the differences we're seeing in the carcass specs they're looking for first is that Spain, it's nearly producing for the domestic market. So if we take the Irish situation, the bones and 9 out of 10 cattle are exported, whereas in Spain it's nearly the inverse. So 1 out of every 10 cattle roughly is exported. But when it comes to what we actually see on the ground, Catherine, we've seen some very, very good calf to beef and calf to rosé veal units. And I suppose it's worth mentioning that we had great help from Cecilia Ruiz and Seamus McMenamin for being organising the trip. So unlike Ireland, Catherine, all animals are housed. So calves arrive in and they never leave a shed until they're slaughtered. Grazing does occur in certain regions within Spain, so particularly up the north. But the farms we're visiting in the Catalonia region will mainly operate in feedlot systems. On these farms, all animals were basically offered ad-lib diets, ad-lib concentrate diets, and you're generally looking at a meal input over the lifetime 1.8 to 2 tonne. In terms of the way they were buying the calves, Catherine, so calves were coming from a mixture of sources. So they're coming from the domestic herd within Spain. There was calves from France, Germany, and Irish calves on some of the farms as well. So when we look at it, the calves are typically purchased, depending on where they're coming from, between 45 and 60 kilos. In the import, the calf to have a preference for the heavier calf, so a calf that's over a month old. So, Catherine, approximately 56% of the calves imported to Spain are French origin. And from the time those calves leave the farm, their origin farm, to the time they arrive in Spain, it's travel time about 9 hours. The Irish calves account for about 8% of the market out there. And from the time they leave Ireland to the time they arrive in Spain, it's travel time about 24 hours. From the farmers we met and talked to over there, they were very happy with the health of the Irish calf. And I suppose when we look at the total imports from Spain in total, about 65% of all animals brought into the country are under 2 months of age, and the remaining 22% are between 6 and 12 months.
Can you describe the different types of animals and breeds that you've seen on the farms?
Yeah, so Catherine, there's sort of a switch happening in Spain, similar enough to what we might see here over the next couple of years, and that there's more of a focus on beef type animals coming on stream. So if we look at the situation over there at the minute, about 55% of all animals are Holstein Friesian. But to try and improve feed efficiencies, they're actually focusing more on beef sired animals. So they're looking for a more continental sired animal. As it stands, these beef-sired animals account for about 45% of all production over there, and 35% of that 45% are heifers. So their systems are generally bull-dominated, with about 85% the beef in the dairy beef units coming from bull beef.
And can you outline the production system for those then, please?
Yeah, so when you look at the way they're operating the system, Catherine, milk feeding stops at approximately 8 weeks of age over there. There's a major focus, so they're pushing animals on concentrates. They're trying to kill the animals at younger ages. So there's a major focus on trying to get those calves eating milk as quickly as possible. So they're offered a starter concentrate from the time they arrive up until about 12 weeks of age. And when they're getting as much meal into the calf as possible, it means the calf is consuming only about 9 kilos of milk replacer on average. I suppose if we compare that to an Irish situation, they probably have the temperature in their benefit in that the calf doesn't have as much of an energy cost as it would here due to lower temperatures, but it's a system that works well for those farms. Once the calves reach the 12-week point, catching to start moving on to a growing diet, so that's a high protein diet, and they stay on that diet up to about 32 weeks of age. At 32 weeks of age, then they're introduced to a finishing diet, and from that point, from anywhere from that point, once the desired fat scores are achieved up to 44 weeks of age, they're slaughtered. And what they're aiming to produce is an animal live weight of about 400 to 470 kilos. When we take when we think about the situation on the ground in Ireland at the minute, like we're looking at meal costs in the region of anywhere from 400 to 450 a tonne. Generally, it was pretty similar over in Spain, and they were hovering around 450 to 470 mark. And when you put that into context and you look at the cost of their systems of production, the calf purchase price typically accounted for 5% of the total costs. Their feed was high at 56%, but again, that's coming from ad lib concentrate diets, and it's coming from the 1.8 to 2 ton meal input over the lifetime. And when we look at what they were actually spending on veterinary and medicines, it's about 5% of the total cost in the system. I suppose there's been a change in Spain, and a couple of farmers noted on the trip over the last 20 years in that they're actually starting to move, or they have moved away from slatted housing catching. So 7% of animals in Spain are now housed on slats. Previously that figure was a lot higher, but the last 20 years they changed, and now it's nearly all bedding. And the manures that are produced or recycled in the compost are used as organic fertilizer on the tillage crops. When we look at the way the animals are housed as well, so the space allowances can vary from time to time throughout the year. So during the hot summer months, space allowances are essentially doubled, but generally you're looking at 3 to 5 meters squared for finishing animals.
And Sean, I suppose some of the units that you visited, they were quite sizable as part of the tour. Can you comment on how they managed the labour on the farm, considering that the animals were housed for their lifetime?
Yeah, so Catherine, generally when you look at it, they were generally working the systems of about 1 to 1.5 labour unit per 1,000 head of cattle, or 1,000 head of cattle finished. And the sheds that they had were set up in such a way that meal feeding was all automated. So if you had a 10-span shed, there was 10 meal bins with 10 augers working off the shed, feeding each individual pen up along. The forage, so unlike Ireland, they've no wet feed, so they've no silage essentially. What they were doing for forage is essentially just dropping in a bale of straw every so often up along the shed to each individual pen, and as that straw was eaten, we'll say, it was moved, or an extra bale was put in on top of it. What was surprising, Catherine, was there was actually no diet feeder seen on any of the farms. And in terms of the automation when it comes to bedding, like some farmers question the work involved in bedding with straw, but straw blowers are using on the farms we've seen, or the majority of the farms we've seen. What was interesting on all the farms we've seen as well, Catherine, is if we take an Irish shed, for instance, we have the feed barriers to the front and feed barriers to the back, or trucks to the back in a lot of cases for dairy beef animals. In these systems, there was actually a viewing platform the whole way up along the front of the majority of the sheds. And that was, just to put it in context, that was about the height of the feed barrier, the external feed barrier on an Irish shed. And what that meant was the operator, whoever was working at the farm at the time, could easily check the animals in each individual pen without having to go into them. It meant that they were able to pick up on animals very, very easily, or sick animals very, very easily, Catherine. And in addition to that, then as well, all the pens had access to a handling unit at the back. So if an animal was sick in one shed, they never actually had to travel over the yard to receive treatment. They were just moved out of the shed and into the handling unit. The calf rearing facilities, Catherine, were pretty similar to what we're seeing in Ireland. The majority of calves are actually fed through teat feeders on the farm we visited. But you could tell there had been a lot of thought put into the process of feeding calves on farm to try and make it as labour efficient as possible. So in some farms in Ireland, we'd see that where the milk replacer is stored is nearly an afterthought, in that I have a free shed here, I'll put that there. But all the farms we visited, the milker place was actually in the shed right next to the calf rearing shed. And from there it was mixed, the water heaters were there, and from there it was mixed and moved in motorised milk carts to the calf feeding stations.
So huge thought put into labour, Sean, overall on the dairy beef systems. But you mentioned earlier you also visited a number of suckler systems. Can you describe how those were operated?
Yeah, so Catherine, there's a number in the Catalonia region. There's a number of operators who actually purchase calves from the north of Spain. So the suckler herd is predominantly based up in the north of Spain, and they're buying those animals at 200 to 250 kilos. So they're a continental bred weighing, predominantly Limousin, Charolais. There's Aubracs and Partenese mixed through them as well. And they're offered ad lib meal diets again. What they're aiming for, or the rosé veal market again, but they're aiming for a live weight output of 540 to 580 kilos at slaughter. And those animals are fed for approximately 6 months. If we look at the cost of those systems, so the calf to beef rosé veal units, the calf purchase cost accounted for about 10% of total. Whereas when we looked at the cost production of the suckler to beef, or cow to beef as they call it out there, the animal cost actually accounts 50% of total cost, and feed costs represent 50% of total cost.
That's great, Sean. Thanks very much for the insight into the dairy beef and suckler beef systems in Spain.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Sean for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.